Good morning, everyone. It's an honor for me to be part of this panel and to talk to you about smart grid interoperability standards in the United States. And thank you, Nikos and Dan, for allowing me to do this by recorded video, since this week I'm in Irving, Texas at the official launch of the Smart Grid Interoperability Panel 2.0. I'll talk more about that later, but that's why I could not be in Berlin today. Now, I know that on Tuesday, Assistant Secretary Patricia Hoffman spoke to you about the policies and programs promoting distributed energy resources in the U.S. But I'd like to begin our focus on the standardization aspects with a little bit of background that'll help you understand the challenges that we face and the approaches that we took. The North American electric grid is one of the largest in the world. It represents about 22% of the world's consumption of electricity, even though in the United States we only account for about 5% of the world's population. It's a very distributed and fragmented system. It's owned and operated by over 3,200 electric utility companies, most of them private sector entities. Represents about $1 trillion in invested assets and 140 million electric meters. It's also an aging system, and the drivers to modernize the grid in the U.S. Really are focused on three priorities. One is increasing the efficiency of the grid to reduce the need for asset replacement and system expansion. It's estimated that $1.5 to $2 trillion will have to be spent over the next 20 years in modernizing and expanding the system, and greater efficiency will help keep those costs down. Increasing reliability is another major priority. Power outages in the U.S. Cost our economy about $80 billion a year, and it could be much more reliable. Sustainability is another priority. Although we don't have a federal renewable portfolio standard, 29 of our 50 states have adopted renewable portfolio standards, and so increasing the penetration of renewable and distributed resources is an important priority in meeting those goals. We estimate that over the next 20 years, or at least the Electric Power Research Institute estimates that the build out of the smart grid in the U.S. Will cost on the order of $400 billion, but achieve benefits on the order of $1.5 to $2 trillion. Everyone here knows that the modernization of the grid, the creation of the smart grid, represents a significant paradigm shift from today's electric systems. And the key points of these shifts in the way the system is architected and operated are depicted on this slide, and I won't go into them, but I would like to get to the bottom line, which is that in order to achieve the dynamic operation, the incorporation of sensors, controls, the ability to manage demand as well as generation requires a great deal of information automation and very secure communications. And this can only be achieved if, as part of our paradigm shift, we move away from the legacy of proprietary architectures and interfaces and data models used in today's grid to one based on open standards with interoperability and security as fundamental attributes. In making this shift, the need for standards was recognized by our Congress in establishing one of our key pillars, policy pillars, guiding our grid modernization efforts in the U.S. This is in the Energy Independence and Security Act that was passed by our Congress in 2007, and in addition to laying out the responsibilities of the various federal agencies, Department of Energy, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, it also assigned the agency that I work for, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the responsibility to coordinate the development of standards underlying the electric grid. Congress also directed that this framework of standards be flexible, uniform, and technology neutral, that the use of these standards be a criteria for the investment grants awarded by the Department of Energy and as input to federal and state regulators. In looking at what standards are needed to support a modernized electric grid, we had to focus on some priorities. And so we elected, with guidance from both the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the Department of Energy, to focus our efforts on use cases, understanding the requirements, the standards needed to support a large array of use cases in these 8 priority areas, including demand response and consumer energy efficiency capabilities, wide area situational awareness, electricity storage, electric transportation, advanced metering infrastructure, management of the distribution grid, cybersecurity, and network communications. In April of 2009, NIST laid out a 3-phased plan to coordinate the development of these standards, working in partnership with a large array of standards development organizations, some of which are very well known, like the International Electrotechnical Commission, the IEEE, the ITU, and others, ISO, but also a large number of consortia and national standards bodies that produce technical specifications that are essential to the definition of the smart grid. In this 3-phased plan, our phase 1 was an intensive effort to gather together stakeholders from all communities, including the electric utilities, technology providers, regulators, academia, to identify a high-level architecture and an initial set of standards. In phase 2, we put in place an ongoing process to carry this work forward and evolve the standards over time. And in phase 3, we focused on creating a testing and certification framework. In February of this year, we issued release 2 of the NIST framework. That updated an initial release that came out in January of 2010. This document includes a high-level vision and reference model for the smart grid, identifies about 100 families of standards, provides cybersecurity guidelines. We now have a testing and certification framework, and the work has been broadly shared and has been used as a foundation and a key input to the work of the IEC, IEEE, and many other organizations. This work is supported by an organization that I mentioned earlier, the Smart Grid Interoperability Panel. This panel was initially formed as a public-private partnership in November of 2009. It has grown to over 780 member organizations, most of them private sector companies. There are 1,900 individual participants in the process. Works through an open public process, web-based participation, minimizes the need for travel, and its role is to identify the U.S. requirements for standards that are being developed, will be developed, updated, evolved by a broad array of standards development organizations. As I mentioned, the SGIP was initially established as a public-private partnership, and this year we took the step to move it into a self-sustaining mode, and it has been reconstituted as a not-for-profit legal entity, corporation, now supported both by private sector as well as government funding. One of the key deliverables of the Smart Grid Interoperability Panel has been something called the SGIP Catalog of Standards. This is an extremely valuable reference for those who look to the standards needed in developing and deploying smart grids. The best analogy I can give you to think of this document or this database, it's the analog of the physician's desk reference in the medical field. For each standard that is applicable to the smart grid, it not only identifies what the standard is for and its intended uses, but also what the limitations are. And this is very important since many of the standards are continuing to be improved or are under development. It's one example of the power that good standards can have in accelerating the development of new capabilities made available by the smart grid, something that we call the green button. Our chief technical officer of the federal government had the vision that any consumer in the United States should be able to go to a website, click on a green button icon, and get access in electronic form to their energy usage information and make it available, if they chose, to application developers or service providers who could provide analytics on that data to help the consumer either save energy or accomplish other important goals. This capability can only be delivered with the fragmented system that we have, over 3,000 utilities, if we have some standards. And so supporting this capability are a suite of standards developed by the North American Energy Standards Board, which define what data is available, the format, and the protocols for accessing it. As a result of a collaboration by the utility industry and technology providers, this capability to consumers is now available to over 15 million consumers in the US, and by the end of 2013, we expect it will be available to over 36 million, or about 20% of our population. Another important area that we focused on in working on these standards is cybersecurity. As the smart grid evolves, the interconnected nature of the networks and intelligence create many new vulnerabilities that need to be understood and mitigated. In addition to attacks that could, if not properly protected, come through the public internet and penetrate into control systems for the smart grid, there's also the opportunity with the use of programmed logic controllers in devices throughout the grid for malware to be propagated in other ways. Securing this critical infrastructure requires a very sound approach and an array of guidance and tools. And this has been an intensive focus of our effort. In addition to the NIST guidance, publication that we call NIST Interagency Report 7628, it's a 3-volume document that provides guidelines for smart grid cybersecurity. We've collaborated with the Department of Energy, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, in the development of an electricity subsector cybersecurity risk management process. We work with the community across many federal agencies and the private sector in developing new tools that will be helpful in increasing the security of the smart grid. Testing and certification is another essential aspect of standardization. The standards specifications include many options. In some cases, many cases, they're described in English or language as opposed to formal methods. And so to ensure interoperability requires testing programs and certification that those tests have been conducted in an appropriate way. Through the Smart Grid Interoperability Panel, we've developed a testing and certification framework. We call it the Interoperability Process Reference Manual, or IPRM for short. This document, which is now in its second iteration, is based on the International Standards for Conformance Assessment produced by IEC and ISO, and it establishes a framework of testing laboratories, certification authorities that over time will grow a portfolio of testing and certification programs to increase the assurance that smart grid implementations are interoperable. At the current time, there are about 7 programs that have been established in conformance with this framework. Many more are needed and will be developed. I'd like to close with a few comments on international collaboration. This has been a key principle of our work from the very start. If you look at the standards that we've identified in the NIST Framework 2.0, we have about 100 families of standards, and roughly 3/4 of them are from international organizations. And that's important because the electric grid really has to obey the laws of physics, which don't respect national boundaries. In addition to work through the international organizations, we have many bilateral cooperations. A few that I would highlight are a cooperation agreement with the EU Smart Grid Coordination Group, We have cooperated very closely with Japan's smart grid efforts, with the Korea Smart Grid Association and Korean Agency for Technology and Standards. We've had significant interaction with State Grid of China and many other countries. So this has been a very important and fruitful part of our activity. And you'll be hearing in a little bit from my colleague Russ Conklin about the role of ISGAN in fostering collaboration on standards, and ISGAN has been connected to our efforts as well in the SGIP. So with that, I will close, and although I'm not there with you to take questions, I would invite you to send me any questions by email or contact me by telephone. Thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you the best of luck in the rest of this conference.